Slowly blooms the rose within. 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 So just resting again for a moment in the breath. And becoming gently aware of your own heartbeat. The breath and the heartbeat, like built-in prayer beads. And they're just always there, available to call us back to the life of God within us, the life of God coursing through us with every breath, every heartbeat. The words I'm going to share as we listen with the ear of our heart in the silence, they come from the Episcopal Church's last presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Shorey. And she offered these at St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem, preaching to an interfaith pilgrimage group of Jews and Christians and Muslims. She said, "The distinctions of our traditions, rote and ritual, habit and custom, theological formulations, those are guideposts, laws and patterns that shape us for holiness. But those distinctions are not the fullness of our created nature. If we have the courage to look beyond those fences and guardrails, we can catch a glimpse of the Holy One already creating new possibility in our hearts. Those roads all flow from the same source. Slow down. Rest in the truth of God's oneness. Slow down. God's creation reflects its source, and no part of it can be diminished by that oneness. Breathe in God's creative, loving breath. Fear and suspicion cannot long survive that kind of of slowing down. Amen. So welcome back and welcome. So we'll continue with this exploration of Ibn Arabi, but before we turn the corner fully, just any questions arising from what we've explored in the first session this morning? 10,000. Any questions that feel pressing, or that you want to, any thoughts you want to raise before we continue?
Just a very basic one.
Yeah.
Matthew. Is God referred to as He, as traditionally so in other religions?
Oh, you mean in the Islamic tradition?
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Actually, one of the great things about the Persian language in which Rumi's poetry arose, pronouns are not gendered in Persian. And so all the torment we go through with he, she, them, they, what are your pronouns? In Persian, just gone, because they're just the pronoun. They're just the human pronoun. And so it's dissolved in that language, which is so cool. And unfortunately, in the Romance languages, like, we gender everything. Like in Spanish, a table is gendered or a chair is gendered, and but in Arabic, there are gendered pronouns. The pronoun for God, we'll look at this later, hu, who. It's the same in Hebrew. Hebrew and Arabic have the same pronoun used for God, who. And in the Sufi tradition, that pronoun, it actually is, it's understood as referring to the divine essence that is beyond name and form. And it's chanted in the tradition much like a Sanskrit om. Ooh. Maybe you just try that. Ooh. So that pronoun points to that essence, and it's understood as being beyond gender, but technically it is a gendered pronoun in Arabic. But when it gets translated over into Farsi or Persian, which Rumi wrote and spoke in, then the gender drops out and it's gone.
And when it's translated to English, for instance, English-speaking prayer.
Oh yeah, it all depends on the translator. And so there are gender-inclusive translations of the Quran, for example. One of my teachers, Camille Helminski, she's actually working on a complete translation of the Quran now, and her translation isn't gendered. Some translations will use he, some will just say God, and but in turn of the century translations, which probably most people are picking up, it would still, just like most English biblical translations, would say he. You may all know, or you may not know, the New Revised Standard Version that most Episcopal churches read on Sunday mornings. There's just newly this year a new Revised Standard Version, and they've worked to make it more gender inclusive and gender neutral. So that's work that's being done in all the traditions, right? But yes, classically, Hebrew, Greek, Arabic have gendered languages.
Muslim friends of mine would say, referring to God, he.
Most of them would, but I know Sufi Muslims who will say she as regularly as they'll say he when they refer to God. And the tradition, the Mevlevi tradition that I've been a part of, in the translations, they actually always use he/she. So it says, he, she creates, and he, she sustains, he, she, so there are Muslim communities that are doing that work. Yeah.
I just wondered, German has three.
Three pronouns?
Yes, and so...
Is it he, she, and a plural they, or a sing? Yeah.
I don't know.
Because in English we have three as well,
We do?
He, she, and they. Yeah. And we've always used they both singularly and plurally in English. If you don't know someone's gender, you'll say, they did this or they did that. So we've always used it in both ways, but we haven't used it as commonly as it's catching on now, which, freaks some people out, but we have always had three pronouns in English. Yeah.
So is there a reason why we just don't say God instead of he, she?
Well, that is what that is what a lot of gender neutral or gender inclusive translations move towards, right? Just ditching the pronouns altogether. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just skip the pronoun.
Yeah, just skip the pronouns. Yeah. Yeah.
Sufism has different orders because it's kind of a one-on-one teaching and it spreads from that.
Yeah.
And what order are you in? Are we studying here?
Yeah, so the Sufi tradition develops in a way a lot like the Christian monastic orders. So you get new orders that come from a founding saint. And so, for example, Saint Dominic, and you get the Dominicans, Saint Francis, and you get the Franciscans. So the same thing happens in the Sufi world. You get a founding saint like Mevlana Rumi, and his lineage is called the Mevlevis. There's another saint, Nuruddin Jarahi, and his lineage becomes the Jarahis. So usually that's some of you may be familiar with Inayat Khan, who was an Indian Sufi saint who brought a kind of universal Sufism to the West in the early 1900s. His lineage is called the Inayatis. Inayat Khan. So it's just like Franciscans and Dominicans. It doesn't sound weird to our ear when we say those. You know, it's the same thing. And so typically what would happen, there would be a saint who would receive some new expression of the tradition. They would gather students, and then the students, become a school, and the students. And it is a disciple-teacher relationship in Sufism, which is interestingly the model Jesus worked in. Jesus didn't have the pastor-congregation model that has become dominant in Christianity. He had the teacher-student model, right? He had a close inner circle of disciples. He didn't have a congregation. That's essentially the model that we still see in the Sufi world today. And you do have the congregational model. You might have a congregational imam who leads the prayers in the mosque, and those congregational gatherings happen on Fridays. And classically, the Sufi orders, for those who really feel a deeper call in the tradition, they would gather on Thursday night in a lodge or a tekke. And it's very different in those orders. You don't say, I think I want to be a sheikh, which is a teacher. I think I want to be a sheikh. I'll go to seminary and I'll get my MDiv. It's much more organic. The current teacher recognizes the maturity in someone and might, appoint them as a successor. But the sort of ego is taken out of it, and it's not information. It's not you go and learn a bunch of information about church history or systematic theology in a school. The school is the circle of lovers who are on the path of the purification of the heart. And so there's that transmission from a teacher to a student, and a student then might be made a teacher, and then you get a lineage that goes down through the generations. And the word for the lineage is silsila, which means chain or line. And so it's the hand over hand from student to teacher down through the generations. And so Sufi orders typically have this unbroken chain of transmission, where a teacher has their realization, and it's passed on. And the closest thing in Christianity would be what we call apostolic succession. This passing on through the generations. Yeah.
Could you just write the Rumi order and their
Yeah. So Rumi's order is called the Mevlevi order, and that's just drawn from the title that he's given, which is Mevlana. So Mevlana just means like our master, our teacher, and it was the title given to him by his students. And so after his death, his son Veled organized the community into the order, and they became the Mevlevis.
And that's the order that you're in.
Yeah, that's the order that I've been most connected with, the Mevlevi order, Rumi's order. Yeah.
And what's Arabi's order?
Ibn Arabi doesn't have an order in that sense. There are students of his thought, and his thought has kind of become pervasive in lots of Sufi communities, but there isn't an Ibn Arabi order, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Cecily.
Best Rumi book would you recommend? I mean, I've read Rumi scattered, but I don't have a Rumi book that is the ultimate of his teaching?
Yeah, well, maybe we can give, I mean, the ultimate of Rumi's teaching, he wrote a 6-volume, poem called the Mesnavi, and you can get it in translation, and it's big, it's thousands and thousands of verses. But there are popular translations by people like Coleman Barks, and Coleman Barks is not, in fact, a translator. He says he offers versions of Rumi, and what Coleman does, he gets someone who can translate, and he gets them to do a rough literal translation, and then Coleman writes an American-style free verse poem based on that rough translation. So Coleman, they're lovely poems and they've been very popular, but they're not translations. And sometimes he strips out the Islamic nature of the poem, he kind of universalizes and makes things more flowery. And so if you really want to get to know Rumi on his own, a translator like Kabir Helminski is a good translator because he's working more literally and yet poetically. William Chittick has a book that's a scholarly book called The Way of Love that Path of Love, that looks at Rumi's poetry. So we can, maybe put together a bibliography and email it around. Yeah. All right, so to continue on with where we were with Ibn Arabi, he was born in 1165, a little bit ahead of Rumi. Rumi was born in 1207, and he died in 1240. And there's a story that says that Ibn Arabi once saw Rumi as a young boy. Rumi was about 12, and he was trailing behind his father, and Ibn Arabi looked and saw the greatness of the soul of the young Rumi. And his father was already a great scholar and mystic within the tradition, and it said that he said, "Look, there goes a lake followed by an ocean." of the little boy, like that he was this, he saw the ocean in him. And Ibn Arabi is very interesting. Some of the most formative figures in his training were female saints, were women mystics. And women mystics have long had a place within the Sufi tradition. One of the earliest ones is Rabia al-Basri. And Rabia, great stories about her. It said that one time she was seen running through the streets of her town with a pail of water sloshing in one hand and a torch burning in the other. And the townspeople said, "Rabia, where are you going? What are you doing?" And she said, "With this pail of water, I'm going to quench the fires of hell so that no one seeks God out of fear of punishment. And with this torch, I'm going to burn down the gardens of paradise so that no one seeks God out of desire for reward, but so that all seek God for love of God alone." And so she's removing that reward-punishment theology that dominates so much of our religion, right? And she's saying she's centering it on love. And so Ibn Arabi, he studied with these two women, Shams of Marchana and Fatima of Cordova, who were great Sufi saints. And it's said that, let's see, I have a quote here about Fatima of Cordova. Ibn Arabi says, "I served as a disciple one of the lovers of God, a Gnostic, a lady of Seville called Fatima bint al-Mutana, who lived in Cordova. I served her for several years, she being over 95 years of age. With my own hands I built a hut for her of reeds, as high as she was, in which she lived until she died. She used to say to me, 'I am your spiritual mother, and the light of your earthly mother.'" So it's fascinating. These women really formed him, and the same was true of the Prophet Muhammad. His father died while his mother Amina was pregnant, and he was initially sent to live with a Bedouin nursemaid, which was the tradition at the time. Children would be sent out to be with the Bedouin, and then they would come back into the cities. And so he had two mothers with whom he was very close as a child, and they really shaped his honestly, his valuation, high valuation of women, as we saw in the Quran, women were given all these rights that they hadn't had in the previous culture, and he fought against the practice of infanticide, female infanticide. So we see this sort of continuing here in Ibn Arabi, and he's most well known for his philosophy of Wadat al-Wujud, which I'll translate for you. Wadat al-Wujud. And what this means is simply the oneness or the unicity of being. The oneness of being. And interestingly, the word wujud has the same root. We looked at those trilateral roots, this WJD root, in the word wajd, which means ecstasy, that ecstasy. And so it's said that when you discover true being, wujud, you experience true ecstasy, wajd. For Ibn Arabi, this was the meaning. We looked at that phrase, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, and he saw it really as expressing the oneness of being. And he gives us a map. Maybe before the map, I'll tell you his story, how he understood the world to come into being. So we spent time looking at the 99 names of God, right? And they're the Jamal names, the beautiful names, merciful names, and the Jalal names, the names of severity. And you need both to structure a world. So he says that all of the names, or maybe first I'll remind us all, every surah or chapter in the Quran begins with the phrase Bismillah, in the name of God, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, which means the infinitely compassionate and the infinitely merciful. And so this is like this little mantra that begins every chapter. In the name of God, infinite compassion and infinite mercy. And so Ibn Arabi said that in pre-eternity, before the worlds had unfolded from the heart of God, all of the divine names, the 99 names of God, were held within the womb of God, within the heart of God, within the lungs of God, like a great in-breath. So like if you take a big in-breath and hold it, like when you're driving through a tunnel in the car and you're going to hold your breath as a kid, and you're holding it, and you're holding it. He says the names of God are in God like this. You can let your breath out. So it's like that, like all the names of God are like in the ground of being, in the heart of God. And they're wanting to flow out, right? They're wanting to flow into expression. And finally, he says, it's through the doorway of Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim that they're allowed to go out. And through Ar-Rahman, the infinite compassion of God, the door opens and the 99 names of God flow out and the worlds begin unfolding. And we saw the way you need stricture and softness for anything to come into being. We use this example of a river bed. And for water to flow, you have to have firm riverbanks. And without the riverbanks, you get a swamp. And so the names of God are like that. The names of stricture and the names of gentleness. And through them. And they're coming together in all these different configurations to create a world. But to allow something to be, you have to allow everything to be. And so to allow beauty to be, you have to allow suffering to be, right? And so all of the possibilities tumble out into unfolding expression. And he says, but Ar-Rahman, the compassion, allows the names to flow out, but Ar-Rahim, the second name, the mercy, is drawing all the names back into the heart of God. So everything flows out, but then, so Ar-Rahman is like the out-breath that allows everything to be, and Ar-Rahim is like the in-breath that draws everything back home into the heart of God. And so the map that he gives us, and this is my own rendition of what he's saying. If we imagine this circle is the totality of existence, okay? This is everything that is. And in Sufism, the word for this is haq. Haq means reality, or it's translated as truth, the true, the real. And so Ibn Arabi, it's interesting, he uses the name haq for God more than he uses the name Allah, the sort of personal name of God. He most often refers to God as Haq, as the real, as reality. And so this is all that is. And if you imagine, let's say, this is that door that allows things to flow into expression, okay? Everything flows out into expression. And then we can imagine this like an infinity loop, and then everything is flowing back. So everything flowing out and back. And this we can put that personal name, Allah, because the personal God, the God we experience in relationship, only exists when there's a creation. Does this make sense? This is what, in the Christian tradition, Meister Eckhart says there is the Godhead, that infinite ground of being, and then there's the personal God that exists in relationship to creation. That you and I exist in interrelationship, but does this track a little bit? That for there to be a personal connection, there has to be a relationship. And there's the infinite ground of being, and we as a creation experience God personally in relationship. But when that duality falls back, when lover and beloved merge back into oneness, there's only the love remaining, right? And in the Sufi path, lover and beloved ultimately return into oneness. And so Rumi says, you have two eyes, two hands, 2 feet, but if you think lover and beloved are two, what good is that? You cry out, I am the lover, but if you think lover and beloved are two, you either have double vision or you can't count. And so that relationship of two-ness is held in that deeper unity of oneness. And so there's Haq, the oneness, and then there's, we could put cosmos over here. We could also put the name Muhammad. It's interesting. Muhammad in the tradition becomes like the essential name of all creation. It said that the first created thing was the Nur Muhammad, the light of Muhammad, and that it's that light that shines through all of the prophets. And just hearing the bells for a moment. There's a line in the Quran that says, if not for you, O Muhammad, I would not have created the worlds. But it's interesting, the translators put in brackets, O Muhammad. What it actually says is, if not for you, I would not have created the worlds. And we can hear that as spoken to each one of us, you know? If not for you, Mark, I would not have created the worlds. Like, God so wanted you to exist that God unfolded the whole universe just to get you, you know, and God so wanted Cecily to exist that God unfolded the whole universe just to get Cecily. Like, if not for you, I would not have created the worlds. And so Muhammad becomes like this essential name, you know, of everything. So we could put Muhammad here, or we could put the cosmos here. And so out of God's yearning to flow into expression, this is the infinite longing to express itself, and this unfolding begins. But then the finite, we long for the infinite, right? We have this longing for God, this longing for the infinite. And so there's like a yearning that goes in both directions here, this deep yearning that's flowing this way and flowing this way. The infinite longs, it's that in-breath that's like longing to go, and then we're here in the world and we're longing for the infinite, we're longing for God. And it just keeps flowing and unfolding for eternity, this longing moving in both directions. And Ibn Arabi says that flowing in this direction, the divine will allows the world to unfold. And with it, both its beauty and its terror and its horror, all of it, the divine will allows. But he says there's this other movement that he calls the divine wish. And the divine wish is for mercy and love and beauty to really win out, right? And it's the divine wish that is pulling everything back into the heart of God. And he says this tension is, this whole thing is in us. This tension is in each human heart. And that through this, what's being manifested is really the cosmic heart, the heart of God. The heart of God is being unfolded through this. And there's a story that captures it really beautifully of a dervish who had this deep yearning for God in her heart. And she would cry out night and day to God. She would chant the names of God. And one day this cynic passes by and says, "Oh, you foolish dervish. You sit here like calling out to God night and day. Has God ever once responded to your cries?" And she, it's like a knife in her heart. She realizes, oh my God, I've been getting everything to God, and God's never once responded to me. So she falls into despair. And then that night in a dream, a messenger comes to her from beyond, an angelic visitor who says, "Oh, beloved servant, your Lord would have you know that your longing is his response, is her response. That our longing for God is God's longing in and through us. And we take our longing as a sign of God's absence. I'm longing because I lack God. But this says actually your longing is the surest sign of God's presence. That God is longing in and through you to unfold God's self in the world. And so that yearning is one yearning. God's yearning, our yearning for God is God's yearning in us, which is just a wonderful flip of the map. And it's really what Ibn Arabi is saying here, that there's this deep yearning in the heart of reality, that out of it comes the unfolding of the worlds and the drawing of everything back home into the heart of God. And as I said, he sees the doorways. There's Rahman, the compassion that allows everything to flow, and Rahim, the in-breath, the mercy that draws everything back. So we could write Rahman and Rahim. And the fascinating thing about these words, Rahman and Rahim, this in and out breath of God, they come from this root, this Rahm root, which in Arabic means womb. It's the womb love of God, the womb compassion, the womb mercy of God. And so we can see this all as within the womb of God. And it tells us that, we often, in like Greek philosophy, God is like the unmoved mover, right? God is just this, there's no need or yearning or longing in God. But this tells us that actually there's a yearning within the heart of God, that in some sense, God needs us just as much as we need God, that through us, God is expressing God's self in the world. And through the mercy of God, we find our fulfillment in God's infinity, this mutual dance. So, yeah.
You referred to the name when you were describing this process. What was the name of the person you referred to?
Oh, Ibn Arabi, was that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. This is how he describes this, this vision of like the names held in God, and the world flows out and the world is drawn back in, and God is like constantly breathing Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, as everything is arising from and returning into God. Yeah.
Matthew, could you think more about God needing us?
Yeah, well, what this is getting at is that there's Hak, the oneness of the whole thing, the oneness of all of it, but within that, so if you imagine in the ground of being, which is another name of God, right? The ground of being, and it holds all potential within it. All possibility is held within the ground of being. In this tradition, it's the names of God. They're all there. And then ask yourself, what good is a rose that exists only in potential in the ground of being? What good is love that exists only in potential in the ground of being? What good is a beautiful sunset that exists only in potential in the ground of being? And so all these potentials exist within God, and the world is the place where they are unfolded, where they are expressed. So the world is and this goes back to that saying we looked at where the voice of God says, I was a hidden treasure and I longed to be known, so I manifested, I created the worlds. That out of God's deep longing to be known, the worlds unfold. And so that really gives a high understanding of creation. Like, creation is here to express the names of God. And each of us is a unique expression of those names of God. You know, we're each a little bundle of divine names that has never been spoken into being before and that will never be spoken into being again. And, you know, God is wanting to speak the uniqueness that is each of us into time. And so that's why, in that sense, God needs the world. It's the theater of divine manifestation. You know, it's the place where things come into expression. And in the Sufi tradition, this work of purifying the heart is about coming to see the oneness behind the whole dance of manifestation. We come into the drama of the world, and then little by little we're purifying our hearts so we can see the oneness of it all. And there's a story, you know, we've talked about these two sets of names. It's said that the truly mature human being is one who has balanced the names in themselves, the Jalal names and the Jamal names. And we've probably known people who are imbalanced in one direction, you know, like maybe a little too soft or maybe a little too rigid, right? And like you want to have all the names available. And an example of those Jalal names, those sort of wrathful names, the idea is that one who's really purified their heart, God can use the wrathful names through them without ego. Most of us probably need to not try to use those names because it's going to come from a place of ego. But I remember seeing this Sufi teacher in New York City with her community. She walked into the room, and this was before the ceremony began. There's just all this social chitter-chatter going on. You know, everyone's talking. And she just kind of walked in and she looked around. And then she goes, "This is not a Manhattan social hour." And oh my God, you could have heard like a pin drop. Everything went whoosh. And then she goes, "We are here to be in remembrance of God." And then everyone went whoosh, like, you know, into the heart. And it was like, she used this sort of fierce like chop. But it wasn't really to shame or guilt anyone. It was like snap people awake and realize they were unconscious. Like so often we're just in unconscious mental chatter. You know, we're not connected to presence. We're not actually speaking from our hearts. We're just like churning out words. And we're here to be in remembrance of God. And then it was like the gentleness came in, you know, the Jamal names. But that capacity to wield both as needed. Sometimes we need a fierce no to injustice in the world. You know, and sometimes we need gentle mercy. So let's see where we are. I want to turn us a little bit towards practice. But just any thoughts about this sort of vision of like the yearning at the heart of life that is unfolding all that is, or anything else that's coming up.
Allah is kind of like all the manifestations.
It's like, yeah, it's like God's longing for the world and the world's longing for God, but they're held in the totality that is Haq, that is the real, you know. Yeah.
So the ground of being would be on the Allah side and the manifestations.
Yeah, you know, in one sense, like we often talk about God just as the unmanifest, and creation is something separate. But we could say really there are two dimensions to the life of God. There's the unmanifest dimension of God, and the manifest dimension of God, which is us, right? Which is creation. Creation is the theater of divine drama, and it is also God. It's the place where God is unfolding and expressing God's self. It's the manifest face of God, and then there's the unmanifest face of God, which is that eternal primordial ground of being. and they're always in dance with each other, you know, and they're finding their fulfillment in each other. The unmanifest needs the manifest so it can express itself, and the manifest, just to be in the strictures of finitude becomes exhausting after a while, and you want the liberation of returning to the unmanifest. And so you have that eternal dance going.
It's very consistent with ancient Christian practice.
Oh yeah.
Take Muhammad out and put the Christ.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Christ or Buddha nature.
Christ
Yeah.
is present in all matter.
Right.
It's the lover and the beloved.
Yes.
Concepts are subtle. They're parallel.
And in fact, yeah, you really can see. So we could put, like you said, the Logos or the cosmic Christ here. And in the Islamic tradition, that is called the Nur Muhammad, the light of Muhammad. And it really is very close. And so right, if we had like, you know, right, cosmic Christ here, then you have the Father, you know, the ground of being, expressing itself in the Son, and then this yearning, the love, flowing between them is the Holy Spirit. And so you have a Trinitarian kind of map here that you can superimpose over this, because we're all getting at, and that's the beautiful Trinitarian formula that came from St. Augustine, that God is lover, beloved, and the love that flows between them. Yeah.
Is that Muhammad there on the sign?
Yeah, that's what I put there. But I meant like the cosmic Muhammad or the cosmic Christ. Yeah.
And what's Rahman and Rahim?
Rahman is the compassion of God, and Rahim is the mercy of God, and they both come from that root word that means womb. And that's the phrase that starts every chapter of the Quran. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, or the compassionate and the tender.
And how does that interface with Buddhism? Just talking about the Buddha.
How does it interface with Buddhism? What do you think?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we're understanding that in the sense of like, you know, Buddha nature, or, you know, there are the different bodies of the Buddha, the like Dharmakaya and Sambhogakaya, and like these different like layers of, I don't know, I haven't thought out how to map it over to, you know, Buddhist tradition, but think about it and let me know. Yeah, you might have an idea, you have Buddhist background, yeah. Yeah.
So the image I grew up with in church is the perfection of Jesus, and that I absolutely knew I'd never get there. And that was pointed out actually every Sunday. And if you say to me, and you have, to all of us, God is longing for me, and I add in my head, just as I am, I could give all that up. And I could say, and part of my spiritual path is to have as confident as I can a relationship and partnership with a power greater than myself. And I cannot describe that I have experienced. Okay, so if God is longing for me just as I am, wow, that makes that partnership possible.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful
Yeah.
for that language.
Beautiful. Yeah, the yearning, the deep yearning, and that your longing is God's longing for you, in you, as you.
Reciprocal.
Yeah, reciprocal yearning. And to trust our yearning, like often we've been taught to distrust our yearning, but to trust that our yearning has been planted in us by that divine reality, and that it's a homing beacon in us that's there calling us back, you know. And in the Sufi tradition, the term, there's this wonderful term, insan al-kamil, insan al-kamil, which often is translated with that word that Cecily hates, perfected. It means the perfected human being, or sometimes it's translated as the completed human being. But what it implies is that there is a trajectory for human maturation and ripening. That we're not just supposed to plod along, you know, the same as we always are. We're supposed to ripen. that there is such a thing as the ripened fruit of the human being, and that like human beings are like fruits ripening on the tree of the universe, and that as we ripen, we become sweeter, like a fruit on a tree does. We become humbler, more merciful, more compassionate, more gentle. And those names of mercy, which we saw earlier, the tradition says precedes the names of wrath, we begin to embody those names in our lives. And so that is the person who is embodying those beautiful names of God is the Insan al-Kamil, the perfected. or maybe we can make it more of a verb, rather than completed or perfected, the completing, the perfecting. Like it's always unfolding, right? It's always, does it ever end? Yeah, never ends. But the tradition gives us a map of the human journey that tracks over 7 levels. And 7, of course, is sacred number across traditions, right? You have the 7 chakras in Indian mysticism, and the 7 levels of the nafs. Nafs is the Arabic word for self. Nafs. It's the same in Hebrew. It's nefesh, the soul or the self. And so it said that the human self, there's 7 levels that we journey through. And interestingly, St. Teresa of Avila uses the same map in her book, The Interior Castle. And Teresa lived in Spain after the period that was known as the Conviviencia. And this was a period when Jews and Muslims and Christians all lived together in relative harmony. And that would later collapse, and the Jews would be expelled, and it would be the usual human nightmare. But there was a period of fairly harmonious coexistence between the traditions, and we see a lot of influence and conversation between the two. And so the Sufi tradition had developed this map of the 7 levels of the self, and Teresa lives after that period. And interestingly, Teresa also came from a family of converso Jews who really had to convert for their own safety to Christianity. But her map in the interior castle of the 7 mansions, or the 7 rooms that one moves through to the place of union, tracks almost perfectly with the Sufi map of the 7 levels of the self. And so you have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So these 7 levels of self. And the lowest level of the self is called Nafs al-Amara. And you don't need to worry about the Arabic. It means the commanding self. And the commanding self, Nafs al-Amara. And this is understood as the level of selfhood when one is completely fused to their ego, where you're just a walking billboard for yourself. And it said at this level, there's really no gap between impulse and action, right? You're just so fused, like impulse, action, impulse, action. There's no pause in between. And this is a level where there's no remorse. You stab someone in the back and you walk away and don't feel, a bit of guilt about it, because you're so fused to that egoic selfhood. The second level of selfhood is called Nafs al-Lawama, or the blaming self. And this is where we start to wake up to the hold our ego has on us. We start to see it. You look and you go, oh, shoot, I'm a jerk. Like, whoa. But you can't really change it a lot yet. You can just see it, which is a horrible place to be, right? It's like, oh, God, I'm an asshole and I can't do anything about it. Like you're just in, and so this is the blaming self you're seeing. But this is crucial. It's crucial because we have to have insight into ourselves, into how we are in the world, and so this is where the good and bad are in constant tension. We're trying to be better. This is when St. Paul says, the good that I want to do, I don't do, and the very thing I don't want to do is the thing that I do. This is like Paul is waking up at that level and going, oh. So The next level is called it's called the inspired self. And this is the level at which the good begins to predominate in your being. You've actually shifted. This is when you become a moral, ethical human being, okay? You're good. You're essentially good. You're not perfect. You slip up, but you can apologize when you do. You know, you can make amends when you go off track. And so it said that this is the level of selfhood that most religion, most conventional psychology is trying to get us to, just to make us decent human beings. And so so I've heard my Sufi teacher say that for conventional religion, this is what we would call salvation. Like, you're a good person now. But he says that the Sufi journey doesn't begin, or we could say the inner journey doesn't begin until the 4th level. So we thought like it was just about this, being a good person, but the real deep spiritual work begins in these levels. And the 4th level, I'm trying to think what the Arabic is. I'll look it up and tell you after the break. But this level is the level when you begin doing everything you do against a wider backdrop of conscious presence. This is where God really comes in, okay? Like, I want to strive to be in remembrance of the context that I am in. Not just the contents of my life, but the context of my life. Can I do everything against the backdrop of divine remembrance, of the cultivation of conscious presence? And so now we're striving. This is where contemplative practice comes in. And you know what? I think it's, I'm going to look it up. I think it's called the tranquil self. It's like, don't quote me on this. We're going to get it right. But there's a new piece that comes because you're more than just your story. Up to this point, you're still living like in your little ego bubble, right? And it's like, I'm a good ego now, but I'm still an ego. Like, you're still, this is when the ego membrane begins to become porous, right? Begins to become porous and open to something bigger. And it said after this level, this is the shifting point. And from here, it's no longer effort, it's the operation of grace. You know, like, these lower levels really require some conscious effort on our part. Like, I'm striving. And then something flips, and now we're surrendering to the operation of divine grace within us. At the 5th level, it said, this is when you begin to lose the thought, I am the doer. You know, and you start to go, oh, God is the doer. You know, God is the one in control. I thought I was the doer. The divine reality is the doer. The 6th level is this, it's kind of like this, Sheikh Kabir talks about it as like really going through this final crucifixion and resurrection sort of, where you come back to the world now. Like, you've sort of pulled out of the world, and now you need to re-enter the world more fully. And the 7th level is almost like a theoretical absolute that just goes on unfolding, like Cecily was saying. It's just that, you know, do we ever really inhabit that fully? Maybe a few extremely special saints and realized beings can inhabit that. But it's this, like, it shows us what the full potential of our humanness is. Like, that's what we're striving towards, to be so surrendered to the divine will. And this is called nafsi safia, or the purified or the transparent self. You're just utterly transparent at this point to the divine will. And so, like, you're a little tight-fisted ego, and then you're like a little bit looser, and then you're like, okay, not so tight-fisted anymore. And then you become porous, and then you become more porous until finally you become transparent. And God, you're just the servant of God now, right? So that's the map that the tradition gives us. And this is Insan al-Kamil is up here, this completed self, the perfected self, or the purified self, the truly, fully purified self. Well, afterlife implies that life ends. What comes after life, you know? Maybe life just keeps going. Certainly in the Sufi tradition, like the path of consciousness development it continues on. Like we are embodied souls in the tradition. And so the soul's journey, you know, our souls return to God. Everything is returning to God. The Quran says, you know, that everything has come from God, and to God everything is returning. In the Sufi tradition, the imagery of the afterlife, which is very much present throughout the Quran, there's the language of paradise, this paradisical state, and the language of hell, the fire. And the fire is a miserable place to be in the imagery of the Quran. And in the Sufi understanding, these aren't only post-mortem states, they're also existent states. And so the Quran actually says, for those who are God conscious, the garden draws near. So paradise isn't just later. When we're conscious of God, we begin to enter the garden. We're in the garden. And the same with hell. When we're down here, and this, like that's hell, right? We're in the fire. We're in the fires of our own ego. We're in the fires of hell. And so we can see them as states that we live in now. But the tradition would say that those states certainly continue after death. We can continue in that state, or we can continue opening. That you know, it doesn't just end with the body.
So we maintain our particularity.
Yeah, and continue growing, God willing, right? Continue growing, God willing.
It reminds me very much of the developmental stages like in the Enneagram.
Oh yeah. Well, and the Enneagram and a lot of contemporary, you know, personal development tools are just using the classical maps that come from these traditions. You know, Enneagram has some deep roots in Sufi tradition as well. So, you know, it's important to have a map like this in our toolkit when we come into the world as a human being, just to give us a sense of trajectory. Like, there is a purpose for your life's unfolding. There is a direction in which the human life is supposed to unfold. There is such a thing as becoming more transparent to God and being more surrendered to God. And there is such a thing as the ripened fruit of the human being. Yeah.
Can I just add that it seems to me that in life we can move from one to the other depending on circumstances. But you've been having a very purified view of ourselves and our connection to God, and it's all great. And then something happens and we drop right down to blaming.
Right.
Like home base.
Yes.
And then we're challenged to work with ourselves and bring ourselves into that wider perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just because we've started like work at this fourth level, which is really the work of consciousness development, it doesn't mean that we've finished all our work at the other levels. And so, you know, we may still have work to do here, but now we're doing it against this wider perspective. But yes, certainly, you know, you want to, and so the Sufi tradition talks about the difference between states. And the word for state is hall, and stages, and the word for stages is maqam. And so a hall is when you taste a spiritual possibility. So you get a glimpse of oneness and of transparent selfhood. You get a taste of it, but you haven't firmed it in your being. You haven't stabilized it in your being, so you don't live from it yet. But you've seen it. And so now you can strive towards it. When you become really firm in one of these developmental stages, it's called a maqam. A station is actually the word that's usually used. You're in the station of that level of selfhood. And you want to test, you know, if you've really stabilized it, like you go home for, you know, the holidays, right? And like when you're with family, like all your old scripts and patterns that you think you've matured and grown out of, like they all get reactivated, you know, when you're at the Thanksgiving dinner table or something. It's like, so we can be drawn back down to old patterns and behaviors. But the work is to be less and less triggered and caught by those, and to begin moving from just a hall to a maqam, to a stable living from that level.
And also being able to understand that we have a transcendent self.
Yeah.
That we can move in that way without judgment.
Yes.
Towards ourselves.
And judgment towards others, right? Because we realize everyone is where they need to be in their development and their growth, and that we don't have the capacity to judge another soul, you know? Like, we only see a sliver of someone else's reality. You know, I see this little sliver in this moment. I don't know the long history of that soul. I don't know the family patterns that have, you know, I don't know the wounds that are being acted out of. So we might be able to judge an action in the moment, but we can't judge a soul. Can't judge a soul. It's not our job.
We're the whole of ourselves.
Yeah.
I think the fourth stage, the tranquil stage,
Yeah.
your analogy of the chakras.
Yeah.
And that's the heart center.
Yeah.
To the heart center, which is the key. And then the seventh, of course, is the chakra.
Right, is the crown. Yeah, right. And this is, you know, this stage, and I want to look back, like I said, make sure I'm getting the words right here. But this fourth one, you see, it is a transitional point. 3 above, right, and 3 below. And when these are mapped over the heart is the integrating center, is the balancing point. And we'll see that the heart is really central in Sufi practice. That's where we're going to turn our attention. And maybe we can turn towards a little bit of that practice before we move to lunch and come back. Is there a plan to break at noon for lunch?
That was the plan.
That's a good plan.
Yeah.
That's a good plan. Anything else stirring? So, yeah, let's turn a little bit towards, yeah, please.
I feel a very powerful energy in our circle. Ever since I sat down, I can really feel this incredible energy coming.
Well, everybody's been putting some work in since last night, so, yeah, here we are.
It's very interesting how everybody's holding that energy too.
Well, maybe just to work with that energy a little bit, we could do a little chant practice that continues what we've been doing with the divine names. And the practice of the prayer of the heart, which is our familiar Christian term for that, in Sufism, let's see. In Sufism, we're given the word zikr. Sometimes you'll see this with a D, sometimes without an H because it's getting transliterated, but zikr is the Arabic word for remembrance. And it's a word that it has several shades of meaning. In English, you could also render it as recollection. You could render it as, sometimes it's even rendered as invocation, to invoke. And so there's a verse in the Quran that says, in zikrullah, in remembrance of God, hearts find rest, or hearts find tranquility. In the remembrance of the divine, hearts find tranquility. And that other verse we looked at where the voice of God says, call upon me by my Asma al-Husna, by my most beautiful names. And so the practice developed of chanting the names of God, invoking God through the names. And you could work with different qualities that you might need to awaken in yourself. You could take a simple name like Allah, which is just a name that includes really all the qualities. It's a name of totality. And as we said last night, the name Allah is what Christians who speak Arabic call God. It's what Jews who speak Arabic call God. It's what Muslims who speak Arabic call God. And I remember being in a Christian church in Turkey and seeing Allah on the altar, hanging on the altar. And at first I was like, what? And then I was like, oh, right. It's a Christian church that speaks Arabic. That's what they call God. And so as we work with the names, you might feel a little like resistance, like, oh, I'm chanting the name of a foreign God. And just remember, like, It's just the name that anyone who speaks that language uses. But in the zikr practice, you can also work with qualities you want to awaken in yourself. So for example, Sabr is one of the names of God, and it means the patient one. And this is the divine quality of patience. Like, how patient is God to wait, 14 billion years, for the universe to unfold to get human beings? And so in a moment where you need patience, often they're chanted with the word Ya before. Ya just means oh patient one. And so you could invoke the name of God, Ya Sabr, Ya Sabr, Ya Sabr. But as you're invoking that quality, you're awakening the quality in yourself. And first you might be calling on God as the patient one, but then you find you are becoming the patient one. You're taking that name into yourself. Ya Ghafur. Ghafur is the forgiving one. So you're holding a grudge, you work with the divine quality of forgiveness and you invoke the forgiving one until that quality begins to awaken in your own heart. So in both the Christian and Sufi traditions, the heart is seen not just as the seat of emotions, which is how we've tended to understand it in the Western world. The heart is understood to be an organ of spiritual perception. The heart is in some sense an eye that we can awaken, cultivate, and bring online. And the heart is that organ of spiritual perception that can perceive and see from unity. The heart can see from oneness. And the traditions understood that our mental apparatus, it tends to see by way of subject-object duality. Our rational brain cuts the playing field into parts and pieces, into subject and object, so it can analyze and quantify and understand. And that's a great gift. We need those rational tools of perception, but we've tended to think they're it. And the contemplative traditions tell us there's this other organ of perception, the heart, that we can cultivate and bring online, and it offers us another way, a more holistic way of knowing. And in the Sufi tradition, sometimes it's said that we can speak of the quantitative universe, the universe of quantities that you can measure and calculate and quantify, and the qualitative universe. There's a universe of qualities, and you can't really measure or quantify those, but you can know them through the heart. The heart can know beauty. The heart can know peace. The heart can know truth. The heart can know joy, right? These are part of the qualitative universe that we live in. And the heart is the organ of perception that can really read those possibilities. And the heart reads the world by entering into something through sympathetic resonance. The heart reads things from the inside out, whereas the mind reads things from the outside in. The mind wants to cut something open to understand it, and the heart enters into it and reads it from the inside out. And we're beginning to realize that what these spiritual traditions have said about the heart, scientific understanding is now starting to verify. And I've shared with some of you before about the Institute for Heart Math, this California research-based group that for a few decades now have been measuring what they call the energetic heart. And they've hooked people up to an EKG, an electrocardiogram, and they measure the electromagnetic field generated by the heart. And what they found is that our hearts generate an electromagnetic field that extends several feet outside of our body, about 6 feet outside of our bodies. And it's 60 times greater in amplitude than the field generated by your brain waves. It's has more impact. And they found that our emotional states are communicated in that heart field, and that if you're in a jumbled, fragmented state, the EKG can pick that up. And they gave people what they called heart-centered breathing exercises. They had them imagining just their breathing in and out through their heart, coming into a contemplative center, contemplative spaciousness. And they found that the heart field became more coherent and radiant, so to speak, when people were in that contemplative space, and that the field of the heart and the field of the brain waves began to move into entrainment. They began to sync up together. And often our brain's running over that way and our heart's going over that way, and it brought people back into an integrity, a unified whole. And they also found that the human heart is filled with neuron cells. We used to imagine that the heart was just musculature, it was just muscle cells pumping blood. The heart is actually a brain. It's about 60% of your heart cells are like neuron cells. And so they're actually receiving and relaying information. And so your heart field is communicating with my heart field. And you said you could feel the energy in the room. You actually are reading that. And we used to think of this as like woo-woo intuition, and we're starting to realize there's a scientific basis, that there is subtle energetic information that we're communicating with each other constantly, and that the heart is the organ that actually reads and relays that information to us. So if you've ever walked into a room and felt that someone was angry before they said anything, or that they were depressed before they said anything, you may very well be picking up the energetic energy signature that's in the space, and your heart is letting you know what's going on. So the contemplative traditions really knew this, that the heart enters into something and reads it in wholeness. It can read from the inside out, whereas the brain reads from the outside in.
And the heart sends a
It's the
message.
Institute for Heart Math, as in mathematics, heart math, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful, the course.
Yeah.
Fabulous. The heart sends a message to the brain of unease.
Yes, yeah.
And we've always thought it worked the other way around.
Right, that the brain was sending the message, but the heart is sending the message. Yeah,
Of course, we've learned how the heart is sending messages to the brain all the time.
yeah. And so in these traditions, they talk about the work of pulling the mind into the heart, so that the mind is actually baptized, so to speak, immersed within that more unitive knowing of the heart, and so that they're working in wholeness. And I'll read a quote from Kabir, and then we'll just do a little practice and then break for lunch. So this is Sheikh Kabir Helminski writing about the heart. The heart is the antenna that receives the emanations of subtler levels of existence. The human heart has its proper field of function beyond the limits of the superficial reactive ego self. Awakening the heart is an unlimited process of making the mind more sensitive, focused, energized, subtle, and refined, of joining it to its cosmic milieu, the infinity of love. The heart is the antenna that reads the subtler levels of existence. And Jesus spoke of this when he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." They shall see God. We've tended to hear this as, "Blessed are the pure in heart now, for they shall see God later when they die." But the contemplative tradition said, when we purify the heart and we awaken and open the eye of the heart, we see God. We see God in every face and in every rock and tree and creature, in the whole facet of creation. We see the divine through this other organ of perception, through the purified heart. And the purification of the heart is important in this tradition, because it's understood that there's a lot of gunk that can encase the heart. In the Sufi tradition, there are 4 levels of the heart that you pass through to get to the true core of the heart. And the outer courtyard of the heart is where a lot of our thick, heavy, dense emotions hang out. And we have to be very careful when we say, just follow your heart. Right? And we think that's really good, wise advice. Don't listen to your head, follow your heart. And the Sufis would say, okay, well and good, if you've done the work of purifying the heart. But you might be acting from a very superficial level of the heart that's really filled with, drama and ego emotion. And you have to really sift through that, free that from the narratives that we bind it with, and get down to the real clear seeing and knowing of the heart. So let's offer a chant, and then we'll, because I could just keep going right through lunch. But let's work with this phrase that is about the purification of the heart that we've spoken about already. La ilah. And I'm going to give you that slightly Turkish pronunciation. La ilah like that. La ilahe. And then Allah. Can you more or less see that? La ilahe. So let's just say the first half. La ilahe. La ilahe. Allah. Allah. So this is that negation, the way of negation. La ilahe. There is no God. And we're sweeping the lesser gods of illusion and separation and greed and pride. We're sweeping the false gods out of our heart. And so when it's chanted, the head turns gently to the right. La ilahe. And then as we turn back to the left and to the heart, we say Allah. And the head comes gently to the left and slightly down to the heart. Allah. We're plunging into that ocean of unity in the heart. So La ilaha illallah. So it goes like this. It's intoned 3 times, slightly longer, and then it goes into faster repetitions. So it'll sound like this. La ilaha illallah. 3 times like that, and then it'll go La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. And allow yourself to feel that. The Prophet Muhammad, he said that for everything there is a polish, and the polish for hearts is the remembrance of God. And so as we enter into divine remembrance through chant, we're polishing the rust from the mirror of our hearts so that it can reflect the divine image in the world. So just taking a breath and join in on the second and third intonations, and then on the faster chants. Coming into the heart, and not thinking about the words in your head so much, but feeling the vibration and resonance in your heart center. La ilaha illallah. La just illallah, only God. Illallah, 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 only God. Illallah, illallah, only love. Illallah, illallah, illallah. Illallah, 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 la Staying with the heart. The Prophet Muhammad said, when light enters the heart, it dilates and expands. Knowledge is of two kinds. One is situated in the heart, which is beneficial knowledge, and the other is nothing but discourse. So may we feast on that light in the heart, which is true knowledge. And may we carry that light to our meal. Mevlana Rumi said that light was the original food of our souls. Our souls ate light, were nourished by the Nur, the light of God. May we sense that light in this food. And as the food nourishes our bodies, may that light nourish our souls. Amen.